Get on rolling. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest specialist with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. Tonight, we are going to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, the state of spotted lanternfly in the state of Indiana. This is something I talk about very often out in public and online. What we are doing is we are monitoring the situation constantly with these insects because they are relatively recent arrivals here, and we want to try to contain their spread as much as possible. And tonight is intended to cover some information you may have heard already, a lot about their biology and their ecology, things you may have heard already. But part of what we'll also cover is where is their distribution now? We had an additional year go by where they had been present. We were curious if they're going to spread and where they would go. And now tonight is the update on what that is looking like. So a little bit on spotted lanternfly to start with. I love this picture. I think it's an absolutely terrific picture, but I'm sure that if you are a grape grower, this is the last thing you want to see. This is a significant number of adult spotted lanternfly who are infesting a grape arbor right now. And grapes are definitely a species they will very, very readily attack and do significant damage to. Sometimes they'll be bad enough that they can actually kill grape plants. So this is a very, very unfortunate situation for whomever is growing this. And this is something that we will often see with spotted lanternfly. We'll have many, many individuals on individual plants that they will return to year after year. And the goal is, obviously, we don't want you to have to experience this. So let's go into a little bit of what these insects are. So these will look a little bit like something you've seen before. Their body shape reminds me quite a bit of cicadas. So you may remember a few years ago when brood X cicadas were out and about. If you took a look at the way their bodies were shaped, spotted lanternfly kind of shares that, where their wings kind of form a little roof shape over the top of them, and their heads look a little bit blunted. They feed in the same way as well. Cicadas, aphids, stink bugs, and several other kinds of insects all feed using what's called a rostrum. This is a syringe-like mouth that they will poke into a plant, and they will use that syringe to drain out those nutrient-rich sap out of that plant. They'll drain out the phloem cells, if you're familiar with your botany. They are capable of infesting many, many different kinds of plants too. So since they don't have to chew their food, that gives them kind of a wide range. They don't specialize. They will just go to a lot of different kinds of plants throughout several states. And I'll talk a little bit more as we get further along. All right, so of course, one of the biggest questions that we get about spotted lanternfly and a lot of our other invasive species are, where do these things come from? Well, like many of them, they are native to Asia. We believe that they arrived here on imported stone in roughly 2012 in Pennsylvania. They were first detected in 2014. So that means they had quite a bit of time to get established in the Pennsylvania environment and start to reproduce. And unfortunately, since then, they have spread very, very rapidly across that state and several others. You have probably heard in the news, especially those of you who visit the East Coast or have family out there, a lot of the stomp the spotted lanternfly slogans, or you may have friends who have talked about how bad they are in different areas. Well, this image right here should kind of give you an idea of how bad that spread is. Now, this is maintained by New York State's Integrated Pest Management Program. I don't think it tells the entirety of the story. I think there's probably quite a bit more, but what it's showing you is the real kind of heart of that infestation in that area. And what you're looking at there is everything highlighted in blue, all those counties, are areas where spotted lanternfly infestations are present. And what we mean is there is an established infestation. They are very, very entrenched there. If you see a little purple dot in one of those counties, that means spotted lanternfly has been identified there. You know, someone saw it, reported it, but there is no established infestation. Now that's just covering Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, etc. But if you look a little further west, you'll see Indiana on there, and you can see that there are indeed, according to this map, as of June 6, 2023, there are 2 counties that are infested. Unfortunately, that is no longer true, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. This is a research study that I love showing because it really kind of tells the story. You can actually see the citation there, Waukee et al. 2019. What they found was that they did an analysis trying to get an idea of the ideal areas where spotted lanternfly could spread as it crosses over the Midwest. What were those ideal areas? So if it's in the green, it's not a very high chance. They're not going to be super successful. As it gets red, they're going to be very, very successful. And you may note Indiana seems to have quite a bit of red there. So we are kind of right in the crosshairs. We have a very, very ideal environment for this insect. Its home environment, its native range is probably very, very similar to ours. And unfortunately, that's actually true for quite a few invasive species, not just spotted lanternfly. Now, we need to understand, of course, how is this insect spreading? We could talk about, oh, it's here, it's there, it's got its great environment, but how's it actually getting there? You would look at it and say, well, it's got wings, obviously it must be flying. Well, that is actually not as true as you think. It's only partially true, let's say that. Spotted lanternfly is actually very good at holding on to things. They're only so-so flyers. Let's go think back to that Brood X cicada that I mentioned a little bit ago. If you remember when those cicadas were all over the place, you may have seen a few of them fluttering around. You may have noticed they tend to bounce off buildings. You may have even had one bounce off you. I know a lot of our students on campus, they deal with cicadas almost every year for ones that we get yearly, and they'll just bounce off anything. They're not great flyers, and neither are spotted lanternfly. But what they are very good at is they're good at holding on to what they land on. And then where they land, if they think it's safe enough, they're going to go ahead and lay their eggs. So what we're seeing is that they hold on and are spreading via routes of industry, where we ship things, where we have lots of transportation that they can hold on to. So the most obvious one that we deal with is rail lines. They will hold on to a rail car, or they'll lay their eggs on the side of a rail car, and then that rail car gets moved across lines, and it'll spread very easily that way. However, they'll hitch rides on anything. It could be your car, it could be your RV, it could be a semi-truck. It doesn't matter. They will lay their eggs on them. We usually refer to them as their egg masses. They attach very readily to objects, and they're very, very hard to find. And one of the things too, and you've probably seen me talking about this if you follow the social media that I run, is that they will also lay their eggs on the sides of trees, which can then get turned into firewood. So you may have seen Purdue and DNR really, really promoting the idea of please burn firewood where you buy it, or where you take it down. Please don't move it anywhere, because you could accidentally spread invasive species, including this insect. So this gave me a great opportunity. I'm going to indulge myself for a moment here. During October was Firewood Awareness Month. And if you didn't know that, you should really look into it, because there's a lot of important messages for you to hear during the month of October. The biggest one being check your firewood. This goes back more than 15 years now, when emerald ash borer was the big thing we were talking about. Back then, I was an undergrad doing research in a lab that was studying the spread of emerald ash borer. And a lot of us know the story of this now. Emerald ash borer came through. It eliminated a significant population of ash trees throughout the state. And unfortunately, emerald ash borer is here to stay. So we want everyone to please keep in mind, those aren't the only insects that will use firewood as a way to survive winters, as a way to lay their eggs, etc. Check your firewood. Please burn it where you buy it. And since it was the month of October, I got to indulge my favorite holiday and some of my favorite horror movies as just a reminder that these insects are here. And unfortunately, we have to do a lot of work to try to limit their spread or eradicate them. So how do we identify this insect? This is the easy part, and this is one of the parts that I love talking about. As an entomologist, I get thrown a lot of insects that people want me to identify. Oftentimes, they're all these little black or brown beetles that have barely any features at all. But spotted lanternfly kind of makes my day because it is so easy to identify. And this picture in front of you really tells the whole story. So what you are looking at is an adult will always have these beige wings with black spots, and then they'll be bisected with a darker area towards the tip. Their hind wings are going to be black and white patches with bright red in them. And then you will see that their abdomens have some yellow striping on them, though their abdomens may not really be visible unless they spread their wings, or if you have a female who has a lot of eggs inside of her that she hasn't laid yet and their abdomen is distended that way. But you can definitely, these insects will stand out. When you see them, they don't look like some of the things that we have here in Indiana quite. You'll see them, you'll think something's off about that. They do have a few things that they vaguely resemble, but thankfully you just have to look a little closer and you'll notice that, nope, this is something I've not seen before, and they'll stand out to you. Now, one of the ways that we are really trying to hope that you report is not the adults, though. It is the eggs and the nymphs, or the larvae of this insect. So this insect isn't like a butterfly. It doesn't go through complete metamorphosis. It won't start as a caterpillar and go into a chrysalis. What'll happen is I'll go through this life cycle here. So starting in September, you will find egg masses on the sides of trees, buildings, vehicles, underneath the eaves of homes, underneath vehicles, which is why I want to emphasize to check these areas if you live in an area where there's a lot of spotted lanternfly. These eggs will remain covered in this substance that will make them look like a smear of mud on the side of something. And they're very hard to identify without having someone show you. I see, yeah, someone is saying that is a beautiful insect. That's such a menace. I absolutely agree with that. I think this insect is gorgeous, but unfortunately it's so terrible, right? So the eggs are going to stay there, and they are going to stay in that form until roughly June. Now, they will hatch out a little earlier than that. They won't stay eggs past June, I should say. You'll probably see your first instar, or the first period in between molts, hatch out around early April. And they will be these very tiny little nymphs that'll have this funny kind of protuberance sticking out of their head, and they'll be black with white polka dots. They're going to stay that way and just grow larger from April all the way through July. And then towards the end of July, they're going to go ahead and molt into their last set of instars, where they'll turn bright red with white and black dots and coloring on them. This is how they were originally identified in our state. Someone took a picture of this red nymph, you can see there where it says fourth instar, and they said, what's this weird mutated ladybug? And thankfully, someone who's an expert in invasive species saw that and said, hey, I know what that is. I need to report this, and they did so. And thank goodness they did, because that way it helped us get started on our work. So the fourth instar that someone's asking about in chat right now, yeah, it does resemble quite a few things, doesn't it? There are a lot of lookalikes for the fourth instar. Lady beetles being the primary one. Sometimes milkweed bugs will also get mistaken for them. That's probably the most common call I get on it, is someone saying, hey, I think I have spotted lanternfly, when it turns out to just be milkweed bugs that are very common in Indiana. The good thing is, I'm going to show you a couple pictures, is that all you have to do is you can even take a picture of it with most smartphones. Most smartphones have integrated into it some kind of like Google Lens or something similar where you can identify them. Though what I'd rather you do is take a picture of it. You could always send it to an extension educator in your county. If you live in Indiana, you have an extension educator in your county who will take that picture, and they'll either identify it for you or they will send it to me and I'll identify it for them. So we have our fourth instar. We're getting towards the end of the summer now. And what's going to happen is they're going to go ahead and molt into their adult form. And they're just going to shed their skin. They'll have wings now. They'll be reproductively active. And those adults will survive from July then on through the winter, or at least a portion of the winter. I was still hearing reports of some adult spotted lanternflies still flying and moving around just before Thanksgiving. Hopefully all the adults are dead now, because we've had some pretty good cold periods. But that's I'm not sure if some of the more southern areas of Indiana have gotten cold enough yet. They may have hidden, but they will not survive. They are an annual species, so the adults will die. And then their eggs, which they'll lay, will be the overwintering form of the insect. So here are some of the real life pictures of these. And what you're looking at here are the very earliest portion of their life, that little black insect, and then the later portions of their immaturity, their late instars, where they're not quite adults yet. You could see they're developing wings on kind of their shoulder area. So it becomes, this will stand out to you, because if you think it's something like a lady beetle and you see that, if you see a lady beetle, you can always tell it's got that nice, neat line right down its back where the wings are. This one doesn't have that. The wings, you could see them developing pretty clearly. And then here are the egg masses. This is the part that gets really challenging. So just for your own self, take a look there and just try to guess how many egg masses are in that picture, because it's a little hard to see them, isn't it? You're going to see a few spots where you're going to see like patterning that kind of resembles alligator skin or something similar, where the eggs aren't as covered. But just about every splotch you see on the side of this tree is an egg mass laid by spotted lanternfly. Let's try this. Let's try it again with a couple other pictures. So can you find the egg masses in this image? Take a moment and see if you can find them. Remember, I said they look like mud, right? I'll give you a little bit of help. They're right in the middle. So this is what we refer to as a cryptic life stage. It's very difficult to find. I've been an entomologist for a good amount of time now. I've been an entomologist for about 14 years now, I think. And I struggled to identify these when I first started working with this insect. And they are difficult to find. Our DNR personnel have worked very hard for the last few years on this insect. They scraped about 17,000 of these in the last year, just in the areas where we knew there were infestations. So, and they were having to identify all these little mud-colored egg masses. So make sure if you see a DNR nursery inspector, tell them thank you. And here's just a picture of an egg mass on the side of Tree of Heaven. This one is interesting because if you look closely at it, you may see some odd divots or holes in the top of the eggs. Most likely the eggs have actually hatched, and those holes are from where the insects exited the egg. So that's kind of a problem where that is. Now, a little bit about their feeding. Here's the business part of this. Why do we care? Why is this such an important thing to us? Well, they feed very similarly to what aphids do. So for those of you who have dealt with aphid infestations before, you'll probably be familiar with what this is going to look like. They will poke their mouth parts into a plant, and depends on the insect what part of the plant, but in the case of spotted lanternfly, they will go ahead and poke it directly into trunks or stems of leaves or things like that. And what they're going to do is just drain out the nutrients from phloem within the plant. Now, they're kind of lazy feeders. According to research by Penn State, they actually rely on the turgor pressure of the plant. So that means that the plant's own internal water pressure is pushing the liquid into the insect's body. Now, they do have a very broad host range, too. Now, this doesn't mean that they're going to reproduce on everything they feed on. That's still being studied, and we're still learning about that. We know that they will be reproductively successful on Tree of Heaven, and I will talk about that a little bit later. So I see we have a couple more questions here. Do we have other egg masses that would be similar for native insects? What is the best way to kill the eggs? I'm going to talk about that momentarily. While there are other egg masses from other insects that may be similar, spotted lanternfly is kind of its own arena because the egg masses are very difficult to find because of the substance that the female covers them in to make them look like mud. If they're less covered in mud, then they kind of do resemble at least the patterning and the way they're laid. That reminds me a lot of like a squash bug. Is it possible to scrape the egg mass from the tree and then dissect the egg mass to confirm? The good thing is you probably don't need to dissect the egg mass because they're their own unique. Usually you can pretty well say that, yeah, it's a spotted lanternfly egg mass. And yes, you can absolutely scrape them, that's for sure. It is an unpleasant task, but it is an important one. Let's see here. So a little bit on what they eat. So I've said before, they have a very broad host range. But there are certain plants that they're going to feed on where they're going to do pretty significant damage, if not outright kill the plant. So I've mentioned grapes. They will feed very readily on grapes, and oftentimes they will kill a grape plant. This is a big concern to a lot of our vineyards throughout Indiana because keep in mind, we are a wine-making state. We have several wineries throughout our state, and a lot of our growers do grow grapes for this purpose. They will also attack American river birch, which is a commonly planted tree, especially in the area that I live in, and maple. Now, it's hard to go anywhere in Indiana and not see maple. And a lot of the maple that we have here in Indiana, we do use for syrup production. Research has indicated that maple trees that are attacked by spotted lanternfly that are used for syrup, they will have lower yield and lower quality of syrup that comes out of them after the insect has attacked them. And the insects can do significant damage to both of these trees. They will also go after black walnuts. This is a very valuable veneer tree in our state. A lot of people will plant this for their retirement. They'll use it as a nest egg, and they will do significant damage to it. So that is very unfortunate for those folks. And of course, tree of heaven. Now, tree of heaven is a nasty invasive tree that we have here in the United States and in Indiana. Like I said, I'm going to talk about that a little more. This is their primary host, though. This is the one plant guaranteed they will go to every time. And then roses. This one breaks my heart because I love growing roses. I'm not very good at it, but I love it. And they will readily attack roses, plus about 100 more other kinds of plants in the state of Indiana and in other places. Now, I see someone that asks, is there any best sacrificial plant to try to use, I'm guessing, as a trap? Some folks say that you could arguably use male tree of heaven because tree of heaven does have two sexes to it, individual trees. I don't really encourage that one myself because tree of heaven is such a nasty invasive, and I honestly don't trust people to be able to tell the difference between male and female trees. And I certainly don't want to encourage the planting of it because it is such a problematic tree. And then are oaks affected? They will, I believe, feed on some oaks, though if one of our DNR folks in the chat knows a little bit better than me, I definitely would invite you to answer that one because I'm not sure, or I can't remember off the top of my head which ones they will go after. So a little bit on their movement patterns here. These guys really are kind of lazy when it comes to how they move from tree to tree. They like to hit the same hot trees year after year. This goes a little bit into the concept of what's referred to as habitat selection. So if the adults are feeding on a tree and they are successful on it, they will have their young feed on the same tree because the adults now know that they can be successful. So of course they want their babies to benefit from that. The nymphs are going to prefer the shoots, the more tender portions of the tree, whereas the adults will go ahead and feed on the trunks. And of course, they're going to move the furthest as adults. Obviously, the adults could fly and they're more ambulatory. Now, their feeding choices throughout a season, though, will vary depending on where they're going to go. Then I can see Vince Werkel from IDNR has said that they have not yet observed them feeding on oaks, so that's good. We already have other invasives to worry about with our oak trees. So a little bit on when they're going to feed on certain plants. So they do shift throughout a season depending on what's available to them. You can see earlier in the season, they'll go for rose, and then later on in the season, they're going to go for river birch, willow, sumac, and maple. However, note those grapes and tree of heaven there, they will feed on those the entire time they are available. Now, tree of heaven is their primary host. They will go to tree of heaven the first if they have that option. That is their primary host in their native range. Grapes just make an excellent secondary host. They'll feed on them if they can get them if there's nothing else. So I said I would talk a little bit about tree of heaven here, and I can't emphasize enough, this is one of the nastiest invasive plants that we deal with here in Indiana. It's destructive, it smells terrible, and it's just a bad plant overall. Now, it is not thoroughly infested the entire state. There are several areas that don't have much tree of heaven. I live in one of those areas, so I live in Terre Haute, and we don't have a whole lot of tree of heaven throughout the residential areas of Terre Haute, though I started finding a couple in my property this year, which is very frustrating. So this is an invasive, obviously, and it's very widespread depending on where you live. The areas where infestations exist have a lot of tree of heaven. And like I said before, it is the primary host in their native range. So they come from the same place and they rely on each other. Spotted lanternfly will feed on tree of heaven. They will experience reproductive success on tree of heaven as well. A lot of those pictures of egg masses you saw were taken on the sides of tree of heaven. Now, I want to make sure that before you walk away this evening, you can identify tree of heaven. The good news is that it does look quite a bit different from a lot of the other trees that we have throughout our state. Right now, you're seeing a picture of some of the bark of tree of heaven. Now, it does have a few different names, and I want to emphasize sometimes people may try to sell these under these names, which I cannot even begin to fathom myself, but they may be called Chinese sumac, stink tree, or stinking sumac. Don't buy them, don't plant them. You will save yourself a world of hurt. They can get quite large and they can develop from parts and pieces. So if you're removing it and you miss a portion of the root system, you have not removed the tree. It will come right back. They have an extremely noticeable smell. I've heard people describe it a few different ways, like rancid peanut butter. To me, it smelled like butter that had gone bad, or maybe bad pecans. And I was smelling it off of very small saplings that I found on my property. And that gives you an idea of just how bad that is. Like I noticed it off of saplings. And if you break any of those parts, the smell will get even worse. And it's not one that you want to have around. Now, let's see a little bit on their leaves. So the pictures you're seeing here come from a couple of different sources. One of them is Lenny Farley, our Purdue forester. You can also see Dave Jackson, Penn State University, provide another image here. So they have what is called a compound leaf. So for those of you who don't know, that bottom image there isn't a branch with individual leaves. That is a leaf with several leaflets on it. That is what their leaves look like. They are arranged alternately on whatever branch they're coming out of, and they will have an entire leaf margin. So that means that their leaves don't have any kind of serration along them. They're just going to have a solid edge, with one exception. You could see there towards the base of the leaf, it almost looks like it has some kind of teeth at the bottom there. There we go. That is actually a gland that's at the base of that leaf right there. And if you find that, you'll know that you've got tree of heaven. That is one of the big telltale signs that you're looking at a tree of heaven plant. And on top of that, if you're that close to it, you're probably already smelling it. Now, just a little bit more, I like to also point out the bark on this tree too. The bark on it has an appearance that may resemble certain things. I've heard people say that it kind of resembles black walnut. But to me, as the tree gets older and you could see those ridges develop, that looks a little bit different to me. So you may want to like make comparisons. If you're trying to tell if something is tree of heaven, you're not sure, you might want to bring up a few pictures of like black walnut or something similar to make a comparison with. And again, if you're not sure, you can always bring samples, or preferably take pictures and bring them to extension educators in the county you live in. You're always free to contact me as well. So the damage they do, I've told you how they feed, and I've told you what they feed on and what to look for. Now, what is the actual damage they do? So I mentioned earlier, those of you who are familiar with aphids, you'll be familiar with this kind of damage. The actual mechanics of their feeding will wound the plant. It will create an opening that will have some sap flow sometimes, maybe a tiny bit, and it will allow pathogens to enter. Over time, you'll see that the leaves or the areas where they fed, primarily on trunks really with this insect, you're going to see they become wet. They may begin to lose a little bit of their structure depending on the kind of plant they fed on. Unfortunately, too, as they feed, we found that they will lose the ability to be as successful as they overwinter. The insects are literally draining the food the plant uses to survive over the winter. So, of course, they don't do as well over the course of the winter. And unfortunately, on some trees, they just don't survive. Some of them get too many spotted lanternfly, they lose too much of their energy, and they take too much damage. What you can look at is you will notice that the trees will start to show signs of stress. You may see some top-down death happen with the tree. The crown death may occur. You're going to see them lose resilience in the middle of like an ecosystem disturbance. Those trees won't bounce back as quickly. And like I said, it may reduce growth or kill the plant, depending on what they're feeding on. The other part of damage that we also want to make sure that we cover is the indirect portion of it. So since spotted lanternfly are feeding on the tree sap or whatever plant sap, it's a very sugar intense diet. Their bodies can't process all of the sugar that they're taking in, so they have to excrete it. And what they'll do is they'll excrete it in the form that we call honeydew. It's just a very, very sugary waste. Aphids produce honeydew as well. I actually had a pretty bad aphid infestation on my coneflowers this year, and my coneflowers got this wet appearance. And of course, they developed sooty mold, which is a type of mold that takes advantage of the presence of honeydew. It's bad enough that I actually had to scrub it off the side of my house. Now, spotted lanternflies take this up to another level. They produce a lot of honeydew, and it can absolutely ruin understory plants. So this nice hosta you see here in this picture, it's ruined. The whole area is just covered with this. And they produce, like I said, a whole lot of honeydew. Kind of got ahead of myself there. So a little bit about the existing infestations. So let's talk about now where they have been, where we know that they have been for some time. One of the infestations is located in Huntington County in Huntington itself. This is an image provided to me by our DNR personnel, and what you're seeing here is that every red dot on the map represents a tree of heaven where a spotted lanternfly has been found. You could see that there are a lot of tree of heaven in this area. What you're looking at here, right where that kind of the center of that infestation is towards the bottom of it, that is kind of an old industrial yard that runs alongside of a train track. Most likely it hasn't been used very much for a long time, so there's probably been very little invasive species mitigation, so tree of heaven was able to develop, and it's spread throughout the residential areas that are just north of it. So you can imagine that the DNR folks have had a time trying to manage all this, because if those infestations are in residential yards, that means they now need to get permission from each of those property owners to go on their property to try to do mitigation. Now, that's a tall order, and they've done a wonderful job with it. It's just there's a lot of work to do there. Now, one of the things in my discussions with them was I was wondered before, does that train track mean that they came here on trains? However, one of the things that Vince Burkle pointed out to me was that the trains there probably move far too fast. Those trains will go through there quickly. They don't stop there. It's not a yard that's really in use. So the spotted lanternfly most likely just arrived through another means. Maybe someone carried it on their vehicle, and the tree of heaven was just right there, so the infestations really took off in that area. So we got a couple of questions. So are there any known predators on them? Do they taste like bad stink bugs? So there is a little bit of work being done on this. There is a grad student out in Penn State who's actually researching this right now. And I believe her preliminary findings have said that birds will feed on spotted lanternfly if they have not been feeding solely on tree of heaven. If they feed a lot on tree of heaven, that probably increases their bitter taste. So tree of heaven has secondary compounds that are meant to ward off insect feeding. Spotted lanternfly has adapted to this. Most likely they sequester the secondary compound in their body, so that's why they get their color. It's the same way a monarch butterfly does. But it also makes it very, very distasteful. However, if they're feeding on something else more, that bitterness probably goes away and the birds will start feeding on them again. But that is very, very preliminary. There's a lot more research that needs done there. And I'm very eagerly looking forward to seeing what that PhD student publishes. And see, if we burn prairie habitat, will that knock them back? No, tree of heaven, I don't believe really appears in prairie habitat. Tree of heaven primarily is going to be appearing around areas like train tracks and residential areas where it's getting spread around. Open prairie really doesn't provide the kind of environment that's going to be welcoming to an invasive like tree of heaven. There are other invasives that are going to try to take over those areas. Let's see. In an effort to control spotted lanternfly, how do we keep tree of heaven from not being sold in the United States? That is dependent on the state itself. Different states are going to have different rules. Like we have our terrestrial plant rule here in Indiana that prevents it. And it's hard to enforce sometimes. A lot of businesses, some folks may not have the best intentions and they may sell things that they shouldn't. Generally, I don't think you're going to find too many places that are still selling tree of heaven because there is so much information out there about how bad it is, but I've been proven wrong in the past. Let's see. And Vince followed up with, it is illegal to sell tree of heaven at nurseries in most states, including Indiana. And Charlotte, no, I was referring to aphids on my coneflowers. I apologize. I was not referring to spotted lanternfly in that one. Are there any efforts to remove tree of heaven from different communities? There are many efforts to try to remove tree of heaven from communities. If you're in Indiana, you may have a local SISMA. This is an organization that's kind of a grassroots organization that was started by the state of Indiana Cooperative Invasive Management. And they work very, very hard to do weed wrangles and other things to remove them, along with the efforts that DNR and other organizations are already doing to try to get rid of them. The trouble is that tree of heaven is just kind of a nightmare plant. It's difficult to eliminate. And I know we have at least a few SISMAs that are present here this evening. So I mentioned the Huntington County infestation. Now, the other infestation that we knew of for the last couple of years was in Switzerland County. This one was started when someone moved from Pennsylvania to Indiana, and unfortunately, either their vehicle or something else may have had some egg masses on it. And you saw pictures of those egg masses. So something like mud was on their vehicle, and they probably just didn't realize. And unfortunately, the area they live in had an infestation of tree of heaven in it. You could see that this is a more rural area. So you could see that now the tree of heaven is less following property lines, it's patchy out in the environment. And again, those dots you see represent spotted lanternfly on individual tree of heaven spread throughout there. Let's see, and I see if there aren't tree of heaven present on your property, but black walnut are present, do you think it is likely that lanternfly will become established? Right now, what we've seen so far is that infestations of spotted lanternfly are associated with tree of heaven. Now, this is me speculating, but what I'm going to guess is that most likely they're going to be more in areas where tree of heaven exists. You'll probably have less chance of them appearing in areas where tree of heaven isn't. And I'm seeing there's Ben's saying it has many evidence that spotted lanternfly will attack spring ephemerals to answer that question up there. Right now, what we're seeing is that spotted lanternfly really is going after mostly woody plants, in particular tree of heaven. I mean, I'm going to keep repeating that over and over. So I mentioned Switzerland County, Huntington County. Now we know that spotted lanternfly has now spread to other areas. And what you're looking at here is a great picture that was taken by Eric Bittinger, who is a DNR nursery inspector up in northern Indiana. This picture is gorgeous, but unfortunately it has a big problem with it. What you're seeing here is an infestation of tree of heaven right along rail tracks. And there have been spotted lanternfly identified in those areas now. There are confirmed infestations in the Mishawaka area. Some of these pictures literally come from that area. They are currently going through and finding that there are infestations where there'll be moments where you'll see a few spotted lanternfly. There'll be moments where you see a much larger number of them. The rail lines in there make a really good opportunity for them to infest, because what's happening is you're not getting trains that are just blazing through that area. There's a rail yard nearby, so there's a lot of start and stop traffic where the spotted lanternfly egg masses can either hatch, or females who are gravid or have eggs are going to hop off and they're going to lay their eggs. And this is how those infestations really get rolling, because of that start and stop traffic with lots of opportunity to lay their eggs on tree of heaven. And these are just a few more images that were taken in that area towards the end of this summer and into the fall. Here is one that I particularly like because I believe this is winter creeper that the spotted lanternfly are on right now. It kind of really takes home that message that they're not just going to attack tree of heaven. They may go after other things too. They just prefer tree of heaven. So what I've done here is I've kind of added a few things to that map. So I mentioned that they were in the Mishawaka area. Since that time too, we've also discovered that they are also in Porter County in Indiana. I was actually talking to the extension educator there who was bringing me samples of spotted lanternfly just a couple weeks ago, and they have been found in Allen County as well. The biggest concerns that we have right now are that each of these areas are along rail lines. So the Mishawaka rail line literally leads right across our state into Chicago, and there has now been spotted lanternfly identified in a park near the Chicago area that is right along that rail line. Allen County is particularly concerning because the Fort Wayne rail lines right there not only connect in that area, but they also connect through other parts of the state. One of them actually leads quite directly down into Tippecanoe County. So that is going to kind of become a problem. I see, is there any responsibility on the railroad to periodically pressure wash their rail cars? That depends on the laws in the state that they're in. Sometimes there may not be a whole lot of regulation for them. Now, I know that our DNR staff are working very closely with the railroads to try to work with them to get some kind of mitigation going. But you're talking about dozens of companies that run hundreds of trains. So it's a really tall order. The best thing that I would suggest doing is that the power really lay in your hands. Put some pressure on your legislators. This is where you can make that kind of change. This is why I'm presenting this evening. I can talk till I'm blue in the face, but your vote's the one that really makes the difference here, as well as your eyes to help report it. So just to kind of sum up that distribution a little bit, so we saw that spotted lanternfly was identified at Tree of Heaven in Elkhart and St. Joseph County, primarily in the Mishawaka area. Since then, we've seen them in Porter and Allen counties. And like I said, Fort Wayne's kind of that major transport corridor that we're really concerned about. Well, all of it we're really concerned about. Now on to the management. What can we do to try to reduce this problem? This has got a little bit of good news to it. spotted lanternfly is nasty, but thankfully it does respond to insecticides. There are actually quite a few treatments. We found that the adults will respond to systemic insecticides. The nymphs you can actually spray for them as well as use systemics. So I think the systemics are primarily used for adults, particularly a chemical called dinotefuran. The other good thing about it too is that a lot of people may have a problem with the use of systemic insecticides because of concerns about how it could impact pollinators. But the thing is that with tree of heaven and the times that they'd be used, you could probably avoid a lot of the damage potential with pollinators. A lot of your bees, they're not really going to be coming to tree of heaven. So you'll be able to avoid a lot of that damage while still trying to get rid of these insects. The real issues that could come from it really are the repeat invasions. So you could completely extirpate a population or get it as close to eliminated as possible, but then the new population just starts the next season as they come in and we move them around. And of course, the dead spotted lanternfly cleanup, they're going to be nasty, could also present its own kind of problem. Now, here's the kind of schedule that Penn State put out on how we could treat these. Now, someone asked earlier, how can we treat the eggs? How can we get rid of those? Well, one, you can do scraping, which I know our DNR staff has done a significant portion of. You heard me talk about that. From November all the way through April, you can just scrape the eggs off of trees. Normally, this is done using something similar to a credit card where you just literally scrape that egg mass. You push down on it to make sure that the eggs are actually kind of popped. You'll feel them pop as you smush them. And then you could put that egg mass into like a plastic bag filled with ethanol or maybe soap and water to contain them. It's not a very pleasant task, but it does help try to control that population. You can also use different horticultural oils on the egg masses. Soybean oil, I believe, is one that's recommended to try to kill them. And then there's also the recommendation of using sticky traps from May through October. Now, I don't see that as mitigation. Honestly, I see that as monitoring because sticky traps, unfortunately, catch a lot of things in them that are going to be off target. So I would use a sticky trap to monitor when they arrive. However, contact insecticides, soil drenches, you could see those are used primarily through the growing season. And then tree sprays or tree injections with systemics are going to be used later on in the season up until the plants start to senesce. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions here. If more ambulatory, as you said, do SLF tend to only be so many feet up the trunk of the tree, a particular range? So unfortunately, we have found the egg masses tend to be a little higher up than eye line in the trees, though Vince, again, if you have more thoughts on this one, please feel free to share them. And yes, that Charlotte, you're actually pointing that out too. Scraping the trees, won't the eggs be high up? Yeah, sometimes they are lower, but unfortunately, a lot of times they're higher up. So if you can't get up there, if you can't do so safely, I'm definitely not going to encourage you to do so. However, what you can do is that they're not only going to be laying eggs on trees. Check your cars, check under the eaves of your homes, check on the sides of your garages, check on your RVs, your boats, etc. Those things that are going to stay relatively stable long enough for them to lay eggs. Those are spots where you can do egg scraping and actually make a difference. Those of you who are more familiar with working in trees, though, you have more ability to go up and do egg scraping in that way. There are a few biocontrol options that are also being looked at to try to control these insects. There are a couple parasitoids. So what these are, a parasitoid is an insect that will lay its eggs inside the body of another living insect. These are primarily wasps, though there are a few flies that will do this. In this case, there are a couple wasp species that will do it to spotted lanternfly, but those species are native to the same home range that spotted lanternfly comes from. And while the USDA is doing research on this, they've also found it's kind of difficult to rear those parasitoids in the lab. So we're not sure how successful that's going to be. We have also found that they are susceptible to certain kinds of entomopathogenic fungi. So basically, think of the zombie fungus that you hear about attacking ants. We have a few native fungi that will just grow on these insects and eventually kill them. Won't necessarily do the zombie thing, but it will be effective at their control. And we have seen a few moments where it looks like they are infesting spotted lanternfly here in Indiana. We just need to get some confirmation on that. You may have heard of a few of them, depending on the kind of circles you run around in, Batcoa major and Bavaria bassiana. I've actually done a little bit of research work with Bavaria using it on crop insects that are pests. So that's something that I have a little more hope will actually help us out there. So what can you do? How can you help out with this? What you can do is obviously remove the tree of heaven, get rid of it. I know a lot of people seem to think that using it as a trap might be an idea. I honestly don't agree with that one. I would say just remove the tree of heaven. It's already a nasty invasive, get rid of it anyways. Please report it. I put the number in the chat earlier, and you can always click on the 3 dots towards the bottom of your chat log, and it will let you download the chat before you go. And I can also share it with you after the fact too. Call 1-866-NO-EXOTIC. That will take you straight to DNR to report it. What we ask for is that you give us an image, tell us where you were, let us know what was going on, so that way we can actually find that spot and confirm that it was spotted lanternfly. You can also report it using edmaps.org or Great Lakes Early Detection Network. I would be happy to show you how to use that if you want to. And then, of course, email us. And like I said, when you do email us or contact us, write down where you are, send me a picture. I got my email is going to pop up here momentarily. And you can always collect a sample, and you could send it into the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory, and we can identify it. Or you can even bring it to a local extension educator in your county. And here is just my contact information if you're wanting to get a hold of me on different social media, as well as my email. All right, so for those of you on YouTube, thank you for watching, and please feel free to put any comments or questions you have down below.